The wind howled across the endless Arctic wasteland, carrying sharp ice crystals that cut against Lieutenant James Calloway's exposed skin. His breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale forming a ghostly mist in the frigid air. His left arm hung limp against his side, blood soaking through the torn fabric of his military jacket. He was the only one left. Hours ago, maybe longer, time had blurred. His unit had been ambushed. A mission gone wrong. Gunfire, explosions, shouts cut short. Then silence except for the relentless, unforgiving wind. James had no choice but to keep moving. His boots crunched against the snow, every step an effort against the biting cold. He gritted his teeth, fighting back the dizziness threatening to pull him under. The Arctic was not kind to the wounded. If he stopped, he wouldn't get up again. As he trudged forward, his ears caught a sound. Faint, barely audible over the wind. A whimper. James frowned. Had he imagined it? Then again, a weak, desperate cry. He turned, scanning the snowy landscape. At first he saw nothing but white, stretching infinitely in every direction. But then, near a jagged outcrop of ice, something small stirred. A wolf pup. It was curled into a tiny ball, its fur matted with frost, ribs faintly visible beneath its thin coat. Its mother was nowhere to be seen. The pup's body trembled violently, barely clinging to life. James stared at it, his mind warring between logic and something deeper. He couldn't afford to carry dead weight. He was already fighting for his own survival. But then the pup lifted its head, weakly meeting his gaze with icy blue eyes. Something shifted inside James. Without another thought, he crouched, wincing at the pain in his side, and scooped the pup into his jacket. The small creature nestled instinctively against his chest, its tiny body radiating a fragile warmth. "We're both screwed, huh?" James muttered. His voice was hoarse from dehydration, from exhaustion. The pup didn't reply, but it didn't resist either. They had no one else but each other now. And so, with one last glance at the desolate horizon, James tightened his grip on the pup and kept moving. James trudged forward through the endless, white expanse, his body growing number with every step. The Arctic wasteland stretched in all directions. No shelter, no signs of life, just an unbroken sheet of ice and snow. His boots sank deep with each step, making his already slow progress even more agonizing. The wolf pup, nestled inside his jacket, barely moved. Its small, rapid breaths were the only sign it was still alive. James had carried many things in his time as a soldier. Heavy gear, wounded comrades, the weight of guilt from missions gone wrong. But carrying a fragile life like this was different. "Guess you're not much of a talker," he muttered, his voice rough from thirst. The pup's ear twitched at the sound of his voice, but it didn't stir. James exhaled sharply, his own breath curling into the freezing air. He needed shelter. With each passing hour, his body fought against the cold, the hunger, the exhaustion clawing at his bones. The pain in his left side, where shrapnel had torn through during the ambush, was a dull, ever-present ache. He pressed his free hand against it, feeling the warmth of blood seeping through his jacket. He knew the truth. If he didn't find shelter soon, he wouldn't last the night. Then, through the thick curtain of snowfall, his eyes caught something. Dark, jagged shapes on the horizon. Ice formations. It wasn't much, but it might provide some protection from the relentless wind. Pushing forward with renewed determination, James reached the icy outcrop and found a small hollow. Barely large enough to shield them, but it was better than nothing. He dropped to his knees, pulling the pup from his jacket. The tiny creature let out a weak whimper, blinking up at him with tired blue eyes. James sighed and reached for his last ration, a half-frozen protein bar he had stuffed in his pocket. He broke off a small piece, offering it to the pup. The little wolf sniffed it hesitantly, then took a tiny bite. "Yeah, not the best meal, huh?" James muttered. "Better than nothing." He ate the rest in silence, chewing slowly to make it last, even though his stomach ached for more. Outside, the wind screamed against the ice. The temperature was dropping fast. James pulled the pup against him, wrapping his arms around its small body. "Just gotta make it through the night," he murmured, more to himself than the pup. "Tomorrow, we figure this out." The wolf pup let out a soft, sleepy sigh. James closed his eyes. In the heart of the frozen wasteland, a lone soldier and a helpless wolf pup lay curled together for warmth, two souls abandoned by the world, clinging to each other for survival. And for the first time since the ambush, James didn't feel completely alone. James awoke to the sound of the wind howling through the icy outcrop, his body stiff from the cold. His breath came out in slow, heavy puffs, the air so frigid it burned his lungs. For a moment, he lay still, his mind sluggish, his body reluctant to move. But then he felt a faint warmth against his chest. The small, steady heartbeat of the wolf pup pressed against him. They were both still alive. James shifted, wincing as pain flared through his injured side. He pulled his jacket open slightly, checking on the pup. The little creature stirred, blinking up at him groggily. Its tiny body trembled, but it was breathing. "That's right," James muttered. "Still here, huh?" The pup made a faint whimper, stretching its stiff limbs. James sighed and rubbed his gloved hands together. He needed to get moving. Sitting in this ice hole was only delaying the inevitable. Food, water, shelter. Without them, they wouldn't last much longer. Carefully, he pulled himself to his feet, biting back a groan as his muscles protested. His wound was stiff, the dried blood making the fabric cling to his skin. He didn't have anything to properly treat it. No bandages, no antiseptic. If infection set in, he was done. The pup let out a soft yawn and stumbled onto its shaky legs, looking up at him expectantly. James exhaled. "All right, kid, let's move." He scooped the pup up, tucking it inside his jacket again, feeling its warmth seep into his frozen ribs. Then, bracing against the wind, he stepped out of the hollow and into the vast, unforgiving white abyss. The Arctic stretched endlessly before him, a world of ice and snow, shifting under the weight of the wind. The sky was a dull gray, blending seamlessly with the frozen wasteland below. It was disorienting, making it impossible to tell where the land ended and the sky began. James walked with his head down, pushing forward step by step, his boots crunching in the ice. Every muscle in his body ached, but stopping wasn't an option. Hours passed, maybe longer. Time felt meaningless in the vast emptiness. His stomach twisted in hunger. His lips were cracked from dehydration. But worst of all, his vision was starting to blur, a dangerous sign. The pup whimpered softly from inside his jacket. James glanced down. "Yeah, I know, buddy. This sucks." But he couldn't stop. Then through the haze of white, he saw something, a dark shape on the horizon. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him. But as he trudged closer, the shape became clearer, a cluster of jagged ice formations, rising like frozen spires from the ground. And beyond that, something else. James narrowed his eyes. His heart kicked up a notch. Wood. A wrecked structure, half buried in the snow, its beams splintered and broken. A cabin? No, too ruined for that. Maybe an old expedition base, abandoned years ago. Hope flickered in his chest. Shelter, maybe even supplies. James quickened his pace, ignoring the burn in his limbs. The pup wriggled slightly as if sensing his urgency, but as he drew closer, a cold feeling settled in his gut. The wreckage wasn't empty. Tracks, fresh ones, large deep paw prints in the snow, circling the structure. James's grip on the pup tightened. Something else was here, and it was watching. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. The tracks circling the wreckage were unmistakable. A predator had been here recently, and judging by the size and depth, it wasn't small. A bear, a pack of wolves. His pulse hammered in his ears. The Arctic wasn't forgiving. The hunter and the hunted often traded places in an instant. The pup stirred inside his jacket, sensing his unease. James tightened his hold on the little creature, scanning the area. The storm had softened the edges of the tracks, but the depth suggested whatever left them was large and heavy. James lowered himself slowly, reducing his silhouette against the snow. His military instincts took over. Assess, calculate, move. The wreckage was his best bet. Even if it wasn't fully intact, it could offer some kind of cover. He crept forward cautiously, his boots barely making a sound over the wind. The world around him was eerily quiet, too quiet. Then, a low, guttural growl cut through the silence. James's blood ran cold. The growl was deep, resonating from somewhere beyond the wreckage. James squinted against the snow, searching for movement, and then he saw it, a dark silhouette, low to the ground, powerful, moving with slow, deliberate steps. The wind shifted, and for a split second, James saw the gleam of pale yellow eyes. A polar bear. James's stomach clenched. This wasn't just any predator. It was the king of the Arctic. A full-grown polar bear could weigh over 1,000 pounds. It didn't just hunt to eat, it eliminated threats. And James, injured and exhausted, was now in its territory. The bear sniffed the air, its massive head swinging side to side. It hadn't seen him yet, not fully, but it had caught his scent. James moved slowly, keeping his breath shallow. Think. Running wasn't an option. Polar bears were faster than they looked. Climbing. There was nothing to climb. The wreckage. It was his only hope. If he could reach it, he might find something. A weapon. A way to hide. Carefully, he slid forward, inching toward the ruined wooden beams. The pup, as if sensing the danger, stayed completely still inside his jacket. James reached the first piece of cover, a half-buried wooden beam. He pressed against it, his fingers numb against the ice. The bear took a step forward, closer. James could see its muscles shifting beneath its thick fur, its breath curling in the freezing air. Then, a gust of wind sent his scent straight to the bear. The massive beast lifted its head sharply, eyes locking onto him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the bear let out a deafening roar and charged. The thunderous roar of the polar bear sent a jolt of adrenaline through James's exhausted body. It was coming for him. Snow kicked up in the air as the bear charged, its massive paws thudding against the ice with terrifying force. James didn't think, he reacted. With the pup tucked tightly inside his jacket, he lunged toward the wreckage, diving behind a splintered wooden beam just as the bear swiped at the air where he'd stood seconds ago. The force of the bear's swing was so powerful that James felt the air ripple from it. If it had connected, it would have shattered his ribs. The bear roared again, slamming its massive weight against the wreckage, splintering wood and shaking the ground beneath James. He crawled backward, searching frantically for anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers brushed against something solid, metal. James snatched it up, heart hammering, a rusted survival knife. The blade was dull, corroded, but it was better than nothing. The bear circled the wreckage, its yellow eyes locked onto him, sniffing the air. It knew he was trapped. James had seconds to act. He scanned the wreckage. Some parts of the structure were still standing, a half-collapsed wooden platform, barely holding together. If he could lure the bear under it, James grabbed a loose chunk of wood and hurled it past the bear, aiming for the far side of the wreckage. The wood clattered loudly. The bear's head snapped toward the sound. Now James scrambled up the ruined platform, his boots slipping on the icy wood. The bear, realizing the trick, let out a furious growl and lunged after him. But as the beast moved beneath the weakened beams, James jumped. Using every ounce of strength left, he slammed his weight down onto the platform. The rotten wood gave way. A split second later, crack. The entire structure collapsed, sending snow and debris crashing down. James hit the ice hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. Silence. Then a low, pained rumble. James forced himself up, coughing. The bear was trapped beneath the fallen wreckage, its massive form pinned under jagged beams. It was still breathing, still alive, but stunned. James didn't wait. He ran. His legs screamed in protest, but he pushed forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't stop running until the bear's growls had faded into the howling wind. Only then did he collapse onto his knees in the snow, chest heaving, his arms tightening protectively around the pup. The little creature licked his chin, its tiny body trembling from the ordeal. James let out a breathless laugh, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, I think we're even now." He had survived, but he wasn't safe yet. He needed food, he needed warmth, and most of all, he needed to find a way home. James sat in the snow, chest heaving, the bitter cold biting at his exposed skin. His body was exhausted, his limbs heavy. The wreckage had given him temporary shelter, but it wouldn't keep him alive. He needed food. He needed warmth. He needed a plan. The pup stirred against his chest, his tiny body shivering. James unzipped his jacket just enough to check on it. The little creature's dark eyes blinked up at him, full of trust, full of need. "We're not dying out here," James muttered, forcing himself to his feet. "Not today." The storm had settled, but the Arctic wasteland stretched out endlessly before him. Rolling hills of white, an ocean of ice, and not a single sign of life. James had no compass, no map, and no idea which direction to go. His stomach clenched painfully. He hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days. The cold burned away hunger at first, but now it was coming back with a vengeance, twisting his gut. The pup whimpered softly. It was hungry too. James scanned the snow-covered ground for any sign of movement. Tracks, shadows, anything. Nothing. But then, a distant movement. James squinted, his vision blurred from exhaustion. At first, he thought it was just the wind shifting the snow. But then he saw it, something small darting between the drifts. A hare. James's heart pounded. It wasn't much, but it was food. He tightened his grip on the rusted survival knife, ignoring the pain in his frostbitten fingers. The hare was fast, but James had one advantage: patience. He crouched low, his breath controlled, his movements slow. The animal's white fur blended almost perfectly with the snow, but James had been trained to track in worse conditions. The hare paused near a rocky outcrop, sniffing the air. Now James lunged. The knife sliced through the air. A sharp squeal, then silence. His hands were shaking as he lifted the limp body of the hare. He hated this part, but survival didn't care about feelings. He exhaled, whispering, "Thank you." The pup whimpered, sniffing the air. It smelled the fresh kill. "Yeah, I know, buddy," James muttered. "Let's get a fire going." Finding dry wood in the Arctic was nearly impossible, but James dug through the wreckage, salvaging charred beams and fragments of insulation. He had one match left, one chance. He arranged the materials carefully, cupping his hands around the tiny spark as he struck the match. The flame flickered, danced, and caught. A small, fragile glow in the middle of the frozen wasteland. James wasted no time. He skinned the hare with experienced hands, his body moving on instinct. The pup watched, its tiny ears twitching at the crackling fire. James roasted the meat over the open flame, the smell making his stomach tighten with hunger. When it was done, he tore off a small piece, letting it cool before offering it to the pup. The little creature sniffed it hesitantly, then took the first bite. James smiled faintly, eating his share in silence. The warmth of the fire, the taste of real food. It was the first time in days he felt human again. But as he stared into the flames, his mind drifted. Where was the rescue team? Did they even know he was alive? Would he and the pup make it out of here at all? As the fire burned low, James prepared to move. Staying in one place too long was a death sentence. But the pup, it seemed restless. It kept sniffing the air, ears perked. "What is it, buddy?" James muttered. The little wolf let out a soft growl, its tiny body tensing. James followed its gaze and froze. Something was moving in the distance, something big. James's heart pounded against his ribs as he strained to see through the fading light. The pup's growl, low and urgent, echoed his own unease. Something was out there, moving towards them, and it wasn't small. He extinguished the dying embers of the fire, plunging them into near-total darkness. The sudden lack of light was disorienting, but it was necessary. Any flicker could be a beacon in this desolate landscape. He pulled the pup close, his hand resting on the rusted knife. His senses were heightened, straining to catch any sound, any movement. The wind whispered across the snow, carrying the scent of ice and something else, something wild. Then he saw them, silhouettes against the pale twilight, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of practiced hunters, a pack of wolves. They were larger than he'd initially thought, their forms lean and powerful, their eyes gleaming like chips of ice in the dim light. They moved in a loose formation, circling, their focus fixed on the area where the fire had been. James's breath hitched. He knew what they were thinking. An easy meal, a lone human, a helpless pup. He shifted his position, backing against the wreckage, using it as a makeshift shield. He couldn't run. He couldn't fight them all. He had to make them think twice. As the wolves drew closer, their growls grew louder, a low, menacing rumble that vibrated through the frozen air. James gripped the knife, his knuckles white. He had to make a stand. He waited until the wolves were almost upon him, their eyes glowing in the darkness. Then with a guttural roar, he charged forward, the knife raised high. The wolves recoiled, surprised by his sudden aggression. James seized the opportunity, slashing the knife through the air, making it whistle menacingly. He wasn't trying to kill them. He was trying to scare them. The wolves hesitated, their predatory instincts warring with caution. They were used to hunting prey that fled, not one that charged. James pressed his advantage, roaring again, waving the knife like a madman. He knew it was a desperate gamble, but it was his only chance. The wolves circled, their growls turning into snarls. They were testing him, looking for weakness. Then one of them lunged. James sidestepped, the knife flashing, catching the wolf's flank. The animal yelped, backing away, its eyes narrowed. The pack hesitated. They had tasted blood, but they also sensed a fight, and they were wary. James knew he couldn't keep this up forever. He was exhausted, injured, and outnumbered, but he had bought himself time. As the wolves continued to circle, James slowly backed away, keeping his eyes on them. He moved towards a cluster of jagged ice formations, hoping to use them as a natural barrier. The wolves followed, their movements cautious, their growls low and menacing. James reached the ice formations, turning to face the pack. He knew he couldn't win, but he could make them pay a heavy price, and he would protect the pup no matter what. The standoff with the wolves stretched into an agonizing eternity. James, his body trembling with exhaustion, kept his eyes fixed on the pack. His knife held steady. The wolves, their patience wearing thin, continued to circle, their growls a constant, chilling reminder of the danger he faced. The pup, nestled inside his jacket, remained silent, its small body pressed against his chest. James could feel its warmth, a fragile beacon of life in the frozen wasteland. He knew he couldn't hold out much longer. His limbs were numb, his vision blurred, and the wound in his side throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. But he refused to give up. He had to find a way to escape. Then an idea sparked in his mind. The ice formations. They weren't just a barrier. They were a labyrinth, a maze of jagged spires and hidden passages. If he could lure the wolves into the maze, he might be able to lose them. It was a long shot, but it was his only chance. James took a deep breath, steeling himself. He had to make them follow him. With a sudden burst of energy, he turned and ran, darting into the maze of ice formations. The wolves, their predatory instincts kicking in, gave chase, their growls echoing through the frozen labyrinth. James weaved through the maze, his boots slipping on the icy ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He knew the wolves were close, their eyes glowing in the darkness, their snarls a constant reminder of their presence. He had to keep moving. He had to keep them confused. He ducked under a low-hanging spire, scrambled over a jagged ridge, and squeezed through a narrow passage. The wolves followed, their movements agile, their senses sharp. But James had an advantage: desperation. He knew he couldn't outrun them forever, but he could outsmart them. He reached a dead end, a narrow crevice between two towering ice formations. The wolves were closing in, their growls growing louder. James took a deep breath, bracing himself. He had one last trick. He waited until the wolves were almost upon him. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he leaped onto the side of one of the ice formations, scrambling up its jagged surface. The wolves, surprised by his sudden move, hesitated. James reached the top of the formation, his fingers clinging to the icy surface. He looked down at the wolves, their eyes narrowed, their snarls echoing through the maze. He had escaped. For now. James, perched atop the ice formation, watched as the wolves circled below, their frustration palpable. He knew they wouldn't give up easily, but he had bought himself some time. He looked around, his eyes scanning the frozen landscape. The maze of ice formations stretched out in all directions, a labyrinth of white and shadow. He had no idea where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay here. He had to keep moving. He looked down at the pup nestled inside his jacket. The little creature was silent, its eyes fixed on him, its presence a constant source of strength. "We're going to make it, buddy," James whispered, his voice hoarse. "I promise." He carefully climbed down from the ice formation, his boots slipping on the icy surface. He landed softly on the ground, his eyes scanning the maze. He had to find a way out. He started walking, his steps slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The maze was disorienting, a labyrinth of twists and turns, dead ends and hidden passages. But James kept moving, his determination fueled by the pup's presence, by the faint flicker of hope that still burned within him. Hours passed. The sun, a pale disk in the gray sky, began to set, casting long shadows across the ice formations. The temperature dropped, the wind picking up, carrying the scent of snow and ice. James' body ached, his limbs numb, his vision blurred. But he refused to stop. He had to find shelter. He had to find food. He had to find a way home. Then through the haze of white, he saw something, a faint glow in the distance. At first he thought it was a mirage, a trick of the light. But as he drew closer, the glow became clearer, a warm, inviting light emanating from a small opening in the ice. James's heart pounded. Shelter. He quickened his pace, his boots crunching on the icy ground. He reached the opening, peering inside, and then he saw it. A cave. A small hidden cave, its entrance concealed by a curtain of ice crystals. Inside, a fire crackled merrily, casting a warm glow across the walls. James stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't alone. Inside the cave, a figure sat hunched by the fire, its back to James. The figure was large, its form shrouded in fur, its movements slow and deliberate. James hesitated, his hand resting on the knife. He didn't know who or what he was facing. He took a step forward, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The figure turned, its eyes glowing in the firelight. A polar bear, but not the one from the wreckage. This bear was older, its fur matted and gray, its eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. It looked at James, its gaze steady, its expression calm. James' breath hitched. He had expected a threat, a predator. But this bear, it radiated a sense of peace, a quiet strength. The bear let out a soft growl, a low, rumbling sound that wasn't threatening, but welcoming. James took another step forward, his hand slowly lowering the knife. He didn't understand. Why wasn't it attacking? Then he saw it. Near the fire, curled up in a ball of fur, a small wolf pup. Its eyes were closed, its breath steady. James's heart skipped a beat. It was the pup's mother. James's mind reeled, trying to process the impossible. The polar bear, the pup's mother, the warmth of the fire. It was a stark contrast to the brutal, unforgiving world outside. He understood then. This cave wasn't just shelter. It was a sanctuary, a haven carved out of the frozen wasteland. He took a tentative step closer, the pup in his jacket stirring, sensing its mother's presence. The older pup near the fire lifted its head, its icy blue eyes mirroring its mother's. A silent acknowledgement passed between them. The polar bear rumbled softly, gesturing with its massive head toward the fire. It wasn't a command, but an invitation. James, his body aching, his spirit weary, finally allowed himself to relax. He knelt by the fire, the warmth seeping into his frozen limbs, the pup in his jacket snuggling closer, comforted by the proximity of its kin. The older pup near the fire, with a tired sigh, closed its eyes and drifted back to sleep. He looked at the mother bear, its eyes filled with a patient understanding. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he was safe here. Days blurred into nights. The cave became a refuge, a place where James could heal, where the pups could grow stronger. The mother bear, a silent guardian, provided for them, venturing out into the storm to hunt, returning with sustenance. She never spoke, never made a threatening move, but her presence was a constant reassurance. James, in turn, cared for the pups, sharing his meager rations, warming them with his own body. He cleaned his wound, using melted snow and the few herbs he could find growing in the cave's sheltered entrance. He learned to read the signs of the Arctic, to understand the rhythm of the wilderness, guided by the mother bear's silent lessons. One morning, he awoke to find the mother bear standing at the cave entrance, its gaze fixed on the horizon. The storm had cleared, revealing a sky of brilliant blue, the sun a beacon of hope. James knew it was time. He gathered his few belongings, his heart heavy with gratitude. He looked at the pups, now stronger, their eyes bright with life. He gently placed the pup from his jacket near its sibling. They nuzzled each other, a silent reunion. He turned to the mother bear, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered, his words inadequate to express the depth of his gratitude. "Thank you for everything." The bear rumbled softly, its eyes filled with a gentle understanding. It nudged him towards the entrance, a silent farewell. James stepped out of the cave, his boots crunching on the fresh snow. The vast, white expanse stretched before him, but now it didn't seem as daunting. He had learned to survive, to endure, to find strength in the face of adversity. He turned back to the cave, the mother bear watching him, her pups nestled at her feet. He raised his hand in a silent salute, a promise to remember their kindness, to honor their resilience. Then he turned and walked away, his steps filled with a newfound purpose. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he would find his way home. He carried with him the memory of the frozen battlefield, the unlikely bond forged in the heart of the storm, the sanctuary of the cave, and the silent strength of the mother bear. He carried with him the whispers of hope, the enduring spirit of survival, and the unwavering belief in the power of kindness. And as he walked, he knew that he was no longer just a soldier lost in the Arctic. He was a survivor, a guardian, a testament to the enduring bond between man and beast, a living echo of the frozen sanctuary. He was a man changed forever,